Hello and welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast. I'm your host Jack Perks, and today I'm going to be talking to Isla Hodgson, and we're going to be looking at the conflict between gamekeepers and conservationists, as well as talking a little bit about basking sharks, which is one of her major passions. Before I start, I got some lovely feedback from a chap called Tony, who asked if I was going to be doing a podcast on baiting. I am going to cover some of the ethical stuff next week, as I have Alan McFadden on, who runs some photography hides in Dumfries, and we'll be chatting about photo hides and baiting. And I may even at some point do a whole podcast on ethics, because it's a huge issue, bloody minefield really, but I'd quite like to talk about it, give my personal viewpoints, and maybe do that at some other point. However, first, we're going to cover the news. So I think for many children growing up in the 90s, dinosaurs were a huge obsession, no small part because of Jurassic Park. So I always keep an eye out for dinosaur news. I used to be able to name every dinosaur, I'm crap now, but I did see something that cropped up this week about the Spinosaurus, and it's changed slightly. So Spinosaurus are colossal. They're one of the largest land carnivores ever, reaching 7 tons and 50 feet long. That's way bigger than a T-Rex. Now recently, on an archaeological dig in Morocco, they found the most complete fossil of a Spinosaurus tail, and for years we thought that they had tails like other theropods, bipedal dinosaurs like T-Rex. You know, if you think back to Jurassic Park 3, you know, the crap one, the tail was quite slender, but we now know that this is wrong, and that its tail was more like a paddle. Think of a giant newt or a crocodile, suggesting it spent more time in the water than we'd previously thought. Now, it's not thought that it spent all of its time in the water, but it was certainly semi-aquatic, which is bonkers. A semi-aquatic, giant, predatory dinosaur. That's awesome. And another semi-aquatic creature is Isla Hodgson, who spends a lot of her time swimming with basking sharks, but also is a research scientist, and in particular has been looking at both sides of the game shooting and conservationist conflict. So I was really excited to chat to her about this work. So hello, Isla. No, Isla?
Yeah.
No, sorry, I'm getting your name wrong now.
With Isla if you want.
What do you prefer to be called? Because I think I kept calling Isabel. I think was at the Grant Arms. I kept calling you, and I thought that's not a bloody name.
I'm used to it because I was called Isla, but I grew up in Newcastle, so no one knew how to pronounce it, so it's totally fine. Just call me Isla.
Isla, okay, all right then.
So
we'll
like
go with
island, but without the ND on the end.
Great, I could probably manage that. Well, look, well, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
No worries, thanks for having me.
So you have a PhD in conservation conflict. What drew you to that?
Really good question. Yeah, it still feels a bit weird when people say to me, you have a PhD, even though it was a year and a half ago. Yeah, so it's a funny story. My career's been slightly wonky. I always say so. It was never really a clear trajectory. So I started out as a marine scientist. So I did a marine biology degree. I specialised in marine mammal habitat use. And then I kind of had an idea of I wanted to go off on a sort of filmmaking career. That was where I was heading. And then just gradually, as I kind of was working through my masters, I started to kind of figure out, well, where can I make the most difference? So what are the biggest problems that we're seeing cropping up time and time again? And something that I'd experienced, you know, going through my undergraduate degree and then going into the masters. And I did a little bit of work out in South Africa, so I worked there for a couple of months, and we were coming up time and time again against this thing called conflict, which a lot of us assume to be when humans or wildlife are having an adverse impact on one another. And what we try and do naturally is mitigate that impact, so try and either keep humans and wildlife away from each other, or, you know, try and limit the impacts that wildlife are having on human lives and livelihoods. And I kind of fell into that trap a little bit. So I got really, really interested in those dynamics. But as time went on and, you know, I got more interested in the subject, I began to realize that, you know, these things weren't really working. So we were coming up against scientific barriers, we're coming up against policy barriers. And also people kind of weren't really responding very well to those interventions. So I met a guy called Steve Redpath, who we would call the godfather of conservation conflicts. He came up with the term. And he just went into his office and was having kind of conversations with him about the subject area. And I said, I'm really, really interested in learning a bit more about this. And I wanted to make a film on it. And he said, well, actually, have you ever thought about doing a PhD? and I was like, no, not really, not for me. I'm not into the academic sort of lifestyle. And he sent one of his students to kind of chat to me, and she did a lot of kind of filmmaking and SciComm stuff on the side. And she kind of said to me, if you're really interested in this subject, that's the route you should go down for a PhD. That's what a PhD is all about, is kind of getting really into one subject. So I decided to explore the world of conservation conflicts a little bit more, because it seemed to me as one of these big, very important problems that we don't really have an answer to just yet in the conservation sphere. So yeah, I kind of decided to do a PhD.
Why not? And it's not as black and white as people think, is it?
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. So as I was saying earlier, we assume these problems we either assume they're between humans and wildlife. So humans are being impacted by wildlife or vice versa. Or we tend to think of them as kind of like a conflict between interest groups. So we see there being, say, for example, there's agriculture or game shooting or hunting, which we see as kind of like, I wouldn't say an anti-conservation interest, but it's sort of like a different interest. And then you have conservation on the other side of it. So we see these two sort of separate interest groups, and we see conflict as these two interest groups sort of not being able to see eye to eye and come into loggerheads with one another. So our obvious route to try and solve these problems is to either figure out a compromise or figure out a way that, one side can be appeased. So whether that's, the introduction of protective legislation, or whether that's providing compensation to a farmer that's experiencing negative impacts. But quite often that's not the whole story. I like to describe conflicts as kind of like an iceberg. So what I've just described there, that's really what's on the surface. So that's what we talk about all the time. They're very visible impacts. So things like, financial problems, or, something that's very, very easy to see and record. But what we don't see is the stuff underneath the surface. So this is kind of all the less visible parts. And that's the stuff that will sink the ship eventually if we don't address it properly and we don't navigate it. And all this stuff underneath the surface is the more social and political issues. So I like to call them the sort of messy human side, as it were, and they're often not easily connected to conservation. So you might have something that's happened, way in the past, that's fractured relationships and created tensions, but that's brought forwards to now. It's just not talked about, but it affects how people react with one another and how people react towards conservation interventions, for example. They might feel, for example, in Europe, you've got a big conflict with wolves over there. Especially in Scandinavia, where you're getting levels of predation, or people are worried about the impacts that wolves are going to have. A lot of researchers have actually found out that the resistance toward the wolf isn't just about impacts on livestock, for example. It's due to a kind of feeling of the state trying to oppress rural livelihoods, and a lot of the resistance comes from that. So this is the kind of thing that makes it extremely messy and very, very hard to understand. And so we tend to miss those aspects, even though they are quite a big part of it. They are the root causes of the conflict.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you get groups, for example, like the RSPB, who employ shooters for pests, for things like maybe foxes or corvids that predate nests. But then you also get, say, shooting organisations that do a lot of conservation. So it's shades of grey, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's very easy. It's you almost want to simplify the problem, because it just seems so massive when you look at all the little intricacies of it, and all the nuances. But the nuances are the things that are going to help us sort of move forwards with things. Basically, what we do when we split people into two categories is you're almost increasing that polarization further. whereas there's a lot of individual differences, like you said, within these groups that are many, many different shades of grey. So you might have, often you get these interest groups and you have people who have very extreme views on either side, but then you always have more people in the middle who kind of have a bit more of a bit more of an understanding of each side. But it's very, very difficult to sort of tease out those voices from the very, very antagonistic ones that you often see on social media, or, there's a phrase called, those who shout the loudest. Yeah, so we see that a lot of the time, and it is extremely hard to you need a lot of time and a lot of effort to be able to kind of tease out those, less antagonistic voices, the ones that have a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, I think to quote your BBC Wildlife article, which is where I first come across you, but it's more than just the bird, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, it is. Yeah, and you can take that quote and you can apply that to many of the different conflicts. So, you have ones over wildlife, which are the ones we see a lot. So, it's more than just the birds, but then you also have, quarrels over how land should be managed. So if we, fall back on the grouse-moor debate, that's not just about the illegal persecution of hen harriers, although that is a very big issue. It's also about land ownership, access, rights. Some people say it's about class. There's many, many different issues that are sort of thrown into the mixing pot, but we often only talk about one. And so when it comes to trying to overcome these conflicts, we don't talk about the complexity, we don't talk about the nuance, we tend to focus on one issue. And that issue tends to be the one that causes the most controversy and gets people the most angry. And so we never quite get to move past that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. I mean, I suppose I lean more towards the conservationist side, but even within conservation, it's quite a fractured. It's not one kind of movement. There's so many different groups that don't necessarily agree how you should just do conservation. I would say, well, no, we should do this and you should do that, which is always difficult if you're trying to work together to do something, if not everyone gets on in the first instance.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the greatest examples of that is rewilding. So there isn't really a broadly agreed definition of what rewilding actually is and what it would mean and what it would entail. People have very different ideas, and there's a whole spectrum of what people think rewilding means, how we would do it in the first place. Would there be a little bit of human intervention? Would there not be? And I find it really interesting. There's always these kinds of dynamics where within a group you find that there's still disagreements and there's still discord, but when it comes to something that threatens the group, then you form an almost group identity and then you start to attack the other group. You see it all the time. So when I was doing my PhD, for example, we always throw gamekeepers into one category, but you would have gamekeepers from driven grouse moors, from walked up shooting. You would have people who were deer stalkers, and they all had very different perspectives and they all thought different things about each other.
Yeah.
So you get that kind of dynamic everywhere. So yeah, for sure, it's way more complicated than we first think. And I think the first step to kind of actually really tackling the problem is acknowledging that it is incredibly messy and it is very complicated, and it's not just going to be, a one answer to the problem. We need many, many different tactics to get past it.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And I think what's interesting about you is that you immersed yourself into both sides. You didn't just stick on one camp. So you did some beating, you were a labourer, I think, and you monitored raptors as well. So you got that perspective from both camps. Yeah,
completely by accident as well. I kind of had to. So they always tell you with research that you should, if my supervisors are listening, I did have a very strict methodology that I followed.
Yeah.
But I think, because I came, like I said, I came from a natural science background. So my first introduction to conflicts was actually seals and salmon. But I came at it from a very sort of ecological perspective. So I was studying seal behaviour, I was doing scat analysis, and I was looking to see whether they were actually predating on salmon. And I went and presented my research to the fisheries board, and my work actually showed in a way that the seals were probably not having that big of an impact on the salmon stock. And yet, as you can probably predict, that didn't go down very well. I had a
No.
very naive view of how that was going to go. I thought I was going to solve all these problems and everyone was
Yeah.
going to go, okay, that's great. Whereas it didn't actually happen like that. So when it came to doing my PhD, I already had a bit of knowledge about how to maybe speak. I've always been very good with people, which I suppose in hindsight was a skill that I never thought I would have to use in a career as a zoologist, but it's actually really, really come out in the last couple of years. But still, at first, I attacked it with a very ecology focused hat on. So I wanted to find out what gamekeepers' attitudes towards birds of prey were and the different potential management interventions that we could potentially roll out. And that was about it. And then I went to, I was going to these kind of big stakeholder meetings, and I was going to game estates and trying to get them to talk to me about birds of prey, which didn't go down well at all. And so no one wanted to speak to me about it, unsurprisingly, because like I said, I was a bit naive, and we deliberately chose a conflict I didn't know anything about so that I wasn't going to be biased in any way. But to get people to actually open up and speak to me, I kind of had to take a slightly different route. So instead of knocking on people's doors and saying, can you talk to me about this really controversial issue that you quite clearly don't want to talk about, to just sort of getting to know people first and getting people to know me. And that involved, working on a few estates during the summer. So before for those that don't know, the grouse shooting season is very, very short. So it starts on August the 12th, but before that, they're working all year round to kind of maintain the estate and, make it suitable for the shooting season. So there's a lot of work to be done. And a lot of that, you get the best reactions out of people, I find, when you're on their terms and you're on their turf and they feel comfortable. So a lot of professions where people work outdoors, for example, that's where they're going to be the most comfortable. They're not going to be very comfortable sitting in a stuffy room with you kind of like straight across a table.
Yeah.
And some of the best conversations I had were those very informal ones where we were just working together outdoors. And we were, managing the estate. And when you're a beater as well, you're in a whole line of people who are kind of going through this very hard physical labor. And you almost bond with people over it. And, people, because they're comfortable, they naturally start to talk to you about these kind of big issues. And as we were having conversations, I started to hear these phrases being thrown around. So it's almost like people used very, I would say, conflict type language, which was talking about it's us versus them. There's a tribe mentality. And it was more to do with relationships and trust and politics than it was to do with the birds at all, or things like economics or anything like that. And so I started to talk to different parties of people to see if this was the same kind of on, as you would call it, the other side. So I talked to members of government, I talked to the landowners, so not just the gamekeepers. I also went out with the raptor monitors as well. So there's a lot of volunteer raptor monitors that go out, monitor nests, and I just asked if I could go along with them. So it was the same thing. I began to realise that both sides were kind of saying the same thing about each other. So it was, kind of throwing blame onto the other camp, or feeling very threatened by the amount of power that they thought the other side had. And that's when I started to think, hang on a minute, this isn't a case of having negative attitudes towards a bird of prey. It's a case of having negative attitudes towards each other, but not really speaking to each other enough to figure out that's how the other side actually thinks.
So they both thought the same thing about each other, basically, but didn't realise it.
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much. So both sides kind of felt on the back foot. So I'd say there was one big commonality between the two, which is both sides had a very sort of, or most people had a perception of feeling on the back foot and feeling threatened by the other side and thinking the other side had more power than them. The other side had the ear of the government, for example. And this had two kind of main reactions. So this wasn't based on interest group. This was just based on different people. But people who felt that there were very low levels of trust, felt kind of threatened and very powerless. they either had the reaction of, we want to fight our corner, so there's no one else that can speak for us, so we're going to speak for ourselves. Or there were people who completely disengaged with the situation. So they felt extremely underrepresented, very powerless. They felt kind of embarrassed about what was going on sort of at a national level, and so they stayed out of it. The problem to me with that aspect of it is that then all we're left with is the very antagonistic, we won't back down kind of voices, and the other ones are sort of pushed to the side. And then you did have this third category, which was people who felt a little bit more accepting of the other side's views. They didn't necessarily agree with them, but they understood, and they were willing perhaps to engage a little bit more with the debate and sort of have a constructive debate. So they all described wanting to kind of move past it. But the difference with those people was that they had better relationships with each other. They had better levels of trust. And I mean trust not just towards the other side, but towards government and towards kind of the national actors. And they felt a bit more well represented. So they didn't feel so at risk, and they didn't feel so threatened. But that kind of group of people was very small.
Yeah,
so,
I can imagine.
Yeah, so I mean, we're talking about a conflict here that has a huge history, and so much has happened. Illegal killing is obviously a massive sticking issue for some people. So that hasn't shown much signs of going away. And that's kind of dissolved a lot of trust, amongst a lot of people. So we're bound to end up in this position. But yeah, so when I actually delved into it and I actually got much, much deeper, you began to understand the mechanisms as to why people were acting the way they were. And it did have a big effect on how people would engage with management efforts. So the people that would go into multi-stakeholder meetings were those people who felt wronged and felt very antagonistic, and they weren't actually going to collaborate. They were going to stand up for themselves. Whereas the people who felt very powerless deliberately didn't go because they felt their voices wouldn't be heard and there was no point, and they would be drowned out by those who shouted the loudest type thing. So since I worked on my PhD, I took on a consultancy for WWF and the Luke Hoffman Institute. And that was like a global analysis of trends in human-wildlife conflict, or conservation conflict, as we call it, and looking at kind of the commonalities between these situations. And a lot of the literature sort of supports mine in that we're seeing these patterns of, how things are governed, these politics, relationships between people. Like, these are the really important factors that are stopping us from moving forwards with these situations. So it's not just the grouse shooting debate, and we're seeing it, and now I'm still in research, but we kind of look at these more global trends in my research team, and we are seeing that there's very similar issues that keep cropping up.
Do you find that being a young woman, does that help you open or get people to open up to you more than you think? Maybe if it was a guy, I don't know if there's anything in that, or do you think that would help people open up to you?
I think it's kind of hard to say.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in the grouse shooting thing, in the grouse shooting thing, in my PhD, that massive thing that I did, I think it definitely helped, but just because it's such a male-dominated industry.
That was my thinking. Just maybe they're more, I don't know, less likely to have their guard up.
Yeah, kind of, in a way.
Okay.
in a way, but it still took me about 2 years to get people to sort of
really? Okay.
Yeah, it took a long time, just because it's such a sensitive subject.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to generalize, but I think definitely, like I said, I'm a people person, so I have a lot of empathy. I respond quite naturally to how people are feeling. So if someone's extremely nervous, for example, you're not going to go straight in with the hard-hitting questions. You're going to ease into it a little bit. So I think that requires a lot of empathy, and you also need to be very clear and consistent in what your research is about and what it's going to be used for, to kind of help people trust you a little bit more. I was reading a really interesting article actually. Sorry to bring up the recent situation,
No.
but I was reading a really interesting article about leadership and kind of what the qualities have been across the globe for leaders to be successful. And one of those key things is empathy. So understanding how people are going to be feeling in these situations and gearing your communication to that. And that helps in all aspects of life, whether that's sort of interviewing someone for a project or whether that's, leading a big conservation project. You need empathy to see how that's going to affect the people on the ground. So yeah, I don't know if that's something that women naturally have more. I don't know if it's because it was a male-dominated industry. But I suppose if I was going to go into a different situation, so say where it was a bit more 50-50 or it was, more dominated by women, it might be a completely different story. And we don't know. But just as a kind of interesting thing as well, is something that we're thinking more about with conflict research is the fact that a lot of times we're talking about conflicts with industries that are quite male dominated. So you're talking about things like agriculture or fisheries or land management. And although it's moving on a lot, it's getting more equal. There are certain cultures where women are traditionally either oppressed or they're not part of the conversation, but they do have very, very important voices when it comes to conflict or it comes to land use and access and rights and things. So we are having discussions about how we bring those missing voices back into the conversation a bit. But yeah, it's a really interesting question.
I didn't mean to throw you that one off. I mean, I just wondered if there was something that you'd noticed with that. So yeah,
I think I only really gave it much thought when someone else mentioned it to me. So you talk about the BBC Wildlife article, and they asked exactly the same question, and it is really hard to say, but possibly, or maybe it's just kind of natural elements that I have in my personality that helped, or maybe because I was just completely clueless about the whole situation. So I went into it completely, I wouldn't say blind, because I did obviously know what was going on, but I'd come from the marine sphere, so I knew a lot about marine conflicts, but not so much about land use. I think maybe I was just naturally a bit more curious and a bit more inquisitive. I didn't have any sort of preconceived ideas of what people were going to say, and I didn't kind of want to bias them too much in one direction, so I just kind of tell me what they thought was important. And also I had the advantage of time as well. I had 3 years to sort of have these discussions and things. So yeah, interesting question though.
So like you were saying, you came into this unbiased, and you're quite an empathic person. So did you find yourself leaning to one side more than the other? Because obviously you've got to try and remain impartial during this, haven't you?
Yeah, you do. And that's one of the hardest bits. It's one of the hardest parts about researching conflicts, because I can't deny that I come from a conservation background. I, like I said, I wanted to work with animals. I was really passionate about communicating about wildlife, and I still am. So you can't deny, I mean, you say you try and be unbiased, but no person can ever be truly impartial. The easiest way for me to get around that was for me to see it as I am a scientist. So any scientist has to be completely objective about their subjects and their data. And so while I was working in that project, that was my role as a scientist. So it didn't matter what my personal opinions were. It didn't matter what my personal values were. I just had to report what was in my data and had to put that out into the world. So it was really challenging at some points. Sometimes people will say things that you completely disagree with, but you keep having to remind yourself, as a scientist, your role is to be objective. Yes, there is a level of interpretation involved, but the nice thing about doing interviews, for example, is that you have your interview data and you can use quotes to back your points up and things. So it's there's no shying away from the fact it is a challenge, but as long as I think you're aware of that, I think you have to be quite self-aware and not let it affect how you behave in the interviews, the questions you ask, and how you interpret your data. So I think that's kind of all you can do. And we've had discussions like that in our research team. We've had discussions on courses I've been on about, I've done a few courses in conflict facilitation and mediation, so how to guide people towards reaching a shared conclusion, for example, or how to talk to one another. The role is the same. You kind of have to be a blank canvas. You have to be quite unbiased, but it's really unrealistic to expect someone to be completely impartial. So it's almost like taking a step back and having a look at yourself and saying, okay, am I being as impartial as I can be, and being quite self-aware in that respect.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I work a lot with a lot of river keepers when I do the fish work, and obviously I'm mainly known for the fish, but I love all wildlife, and I love all river wildlife, and anglers and otters don't always get along. And I've had river keepers casually mention that, they've shot an otter or something like that, and I'm just a bit like, well, you really shouldn't be telling me these things, or there's a big pit and there's a seal over there, and you're like, well, why are you telling me this? And it's because I'm working with this person, but you have to rein it in a little bit. So it's difficult, isn't it, when you've got strong feelings about these things?
Exactly. But I think as well, like, people see conflict as a negative thing. Like, they see it as something that's to be avoided and it's to be overcome. But in actual fact, if you think about it, everything we're talking about with healthy relationships is that arguments are fine. It's okay to disagree on things. It's okay to debate. It's okay to try and put your point across. It's okay to have an opinion, but as long as you can move past that and you can respect one another's views and values and use it as a catalyst for positive change, so conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. And a lot of people have asked me as well, like, what do you do when a gamekeeper, for example, asks you what you think?
Yeah.
And you are told as a golden rule, that you should not voice your opinion at all. You should not put your value across. And I kind of thought, well, I'm asking them to tell me honestly what they think. I'm asking them to be vulnerable with me. So I can't really then become a faceless robot and say to them, well, my opinion doesn't matter, because it does to them. You're trying to build trust. So I would always be honest. I would always say, well, I'm from a conservation background, so I do find some aspects, for example, say of grouse shooting or the land management there, I do find some of that from an ecological perspective quite difficult, but it doesn't mean that it's going to affect how I see you.
Yeah.
So that's how I would react in that situation, because it's true, that is just how I think. So, I found for me in that specific situation that helped people to see me as a human being rather than, and also you're trying not to raise people's expectations too much.
Yeah.
So you don't want to say to them, oh no, I'm completely on your side. And then your research comes out and they're like, oh, well, what about this thing you said?
I guess you're burning bridges then as well, aren't you? Because they're never going to want anything to, if something cropped up and you need to do more work on it, they're going to be like, nope.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, it's quite difficult because you're asking for people's time as well, and you're asking people for someone to be really honest with you and trust you with that information, particularly on such a sensitive subject. And this doesn't matter which side they're on. It's hard for people to talk about their values and their kind of identity. So you want to respect that as much as possible. And there is a little bit of a pressure when it comes to writing up your research. And there are some elements of it that are going to upset one side or the other. So you try and do it as respectfully as possible. And, you're not doing them a favor, they're doing you a favor.
Yeah.
So it's important to keep that in mind. But it is extremely difficult, which is why I said earlier that we decided not to go with a marine conflict, because I don't know whether I would have been able to do that in that situation.
Well, like you say, that's your background, and that leads me nicely on to my last question, which is obviously when you're not playing referee to angry birders, you're more likely to be found in the water, aren't you? And you work with arguably one of the most charismatic and interesting British wildlife that we've got around our coastlines, don't you?
Yes, I do. The Basking shark.
Yeah. No,
Just double check.
No, the nudibranch. Sorry.
I do love nudibranchs. I
Yeah,
do
no,
love
to be fair, they are
nudibranchs.
very interesting. So I'm doing a disservice to nudibranchs. But no, I was alluding to basking sharks.
Yes. Yeah, of course. So I like to keep my toes in the water, literally. I'm a scuba diver. I'm also trained for Sea Search, so that's the kind of citizen science program where people go and record marine habitats and the species that are in them. And then last summer, I started working for Basking Sharks Scotland, who are really cool organisation on the west coast. So based in Oban most of the year, and then at the peak season we go out to the Isle of Coll. And we basically research and take people in the water with basking sharks. So we give them a kind of immersive experience, if you like.
So you're collecting data while you're taking people out to see them as well. It's not just like a fun trip sort of thing.
Yeah. So we have kind of like a dual purpose. So the first one is to educate and raise awareness. We take people in the water, but we're very focused on the sharks' welfare. So it's not as if we just pile a load of people into the water. We do a lot of training with them previously. We follow the Wise Oceans scheme. So our skippers are very highly trained to minimise disturbance. We only take maximum of 4 people in the water with them at a time, because you want to minimize disturbance on these animals as much as possible. But while we're in the water, because the best thing about the basking sharks, so just as a bit of background, they're on average 8 to 10 meters long, massive animal.
That's a big fish.
It's a big fish, yeah. Their dorsal fin alone is 1 meter high, so you can't miss it in the water. It's pretty cool. But we don't know much about them at all. So they're a very sort of elusive species. We know that they come up to the surface to feed every year. They feed on plankton, so they're filter feeders like other large sharks, like the whale shark. And basically all they're interested in all summer is finding as many, of these tiny little crustaceans called copepods, as many of them to feed on as possible. But that's about as much as we know about them. We know from recent satellite tagging data that they undertake huge migrations. So you're talking thousands of kilometers, and over winter they go deep. So some have been recorded over 1,000 meters deep. But what they're actually doing down there, we have no idea. We don't know how they breed. We don't know how they mate. We don't know where they give birth. So there's a lot of stuff we don't really know about them. So what we try and do is we use the opportunity of tourism to research the basking sharks as well. So we take as much data as we possibly can. So we look at unusual markings. So we see whether the same individuals are returning to the same sites every year. We sex the sharks, so we look at whether it's male or female, what the size of it is, any odd behaviours, anything like that. How many parasites they have on them, because sometimes they have parasitic lampreys.
Yes, yeah.
And then every September we do a dedicated research trip. So we do things like plankton sampling. So we found a few interesting things out, such as the sharks they don't just like any copepod, they like a specific genus called Calanus, and even more specific, they prefer a certain size. So they actually look for concentrations where they've got big, fat, juicy ones, which makes sense. And we also have noticed, it's not enough evidence to make a proper scientific conclusion, but we have noticed that unfortunately microplastics are the same size as the plankton that they like to feed on. So the chances are that they might be filtering them out from the water, but we don't know. So I basically keep in touch with the marine side of things through my work with Basking Sharks Scotland, and I'm incredibly lucky to be a guide with them, because they're very, very respectful of the wildlife. And if we don't feel it's safe, or we don't feel that the sharks are going to respond that well, we just don't go in the water with them. Equally, if we are in the water and we have an encounter and the shark's visibly not happy, then we get out. So it's very respectful of the wildlife, and we try and teach people as much as we can. So we also take them to the kelp forests and teach them about kelp forests and the wildlife around there, teach them about seabirds, just kind of try and teach them about the wider marine ecosystem.
I find that bonkers that the second largest fish in the world, and we know so little about it. It's just incredible.
It is. I guess it's for a couple of reasons. So the first one is that the Basking shark was really extensively hunted right up until 1998, I think,
Yeah,
was the time it got.
yeah. I was just about to say that it wasn't that long ago, really, was it?
No, so we're looking at like just over 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And there were huge fisheries, so massive ones. So there were some in Scandinavia, but there were loads around the coast of Scotland and Ireland, for example, because we are one of the hotspots for Basking sharks, which is really awesome. But they have this huge oily liver, so it can be about a quarter, maybe even a third of its body size, and it contains shark oil, so something called squalene, which was used traditionally in oil lamps mainly, but it is also used in cosmetics and perfumes and things like that. And because Basking sharks are, I don't know if you've ever seen one.
I've not, unfortunately. No, I'm dying to. As you well know, I'm dying to.
Yes, they do. You come out with us, but
Yeah.
they're pretty dopey. So they're not really thinking about much other than where the plankton is. They're quite a slow-moving species. They're right at the surface. They don't have much. I mean, if you know what you're doing, so say you're a fisherman, you know what you're doing, and you follow them slowly enough and quietly enough, they won't notice you're there. So they're quite easy to, for someone to catch or harpoon or whatever. So yeah, so their population was really massively decimated by that. So we're only just really seeing the recovery now. So we don't know how many individuals there are out there in the North Atlantic population. And also you've got the second reason is that our technology's advancing as we speak. So it's really hard to tag a shark or get any sort of data off a shark, especially if they're going as deep as the Basking sharks are. So we're only just catching up enough to learn more about them. So there was a really cool genetic tagging study. I don't know if you saw it.
I did. Wasn't this where they found out that there's two different populations or something? Is it the ones in the North Atlantic are different to the ones in the Northeast? Is that right?
Yeah, I think we're talking about the same study. So the one I'm talking about was led by Dr. Lillian Lever.
Okay.
So that was about, I think we probably are talking about the same one. But one of their other findings was that they returned to the same sites.
Okay.
Year on year, and the groups that they're returning in have a high level of relatedness, which essentially means that essentially means that they're kind of traveling with extended family, which is kind of cute. So, and it was mainly the females that were doing that. So it's almost like you and your third cousin twice removed going back to your favorite restaurant kind of thing. Yeah. So we're finding out more about them all the time. But yeah, they're a really awesome species. Nothing beats seeing one of them in the water. So we see the fin. Often you see the nose, you see the tail, and that's how you know it's a Basking shark, and they're just tracking straight through the water. And so our skipper will try and line us up so we're sort of being dropped in front of the shark almost. So we're being dropped in its path.
Just let them come to you.
And hopefully if all the stars align, then you shouldn't have to move that much. Sometimes we do have to get people to swim a little bit, or one of us will hold your hand and basically tow you through the water. But you wait until the fin sort of like lined up with you and you can see it's tracking towards you. And just at the right moment, you get people to lie flat, perfectly still, fins out the water. And all you have to do is put your head down, because you're wearing a suit that's so thick, you're so buoyant you couldn't sink even if you tried. People do. But you can't. And you just wait for it, and it just seems to come out of nowhere, this like massive, great big mouth with all these you can see the gill rakers, this perfect white gill rakers, and you honestly, even though you've seen that, you've had that experience so many times, there is nothing that stops you from going because there's like a huge shark coming towards you with its mouth wide open. Your natural reaction is to swim away as fast as you can. But they're so cool, and they just come towards you, and they'll either sort of like pass right by or they'll go underneath. But they're just not bothered. As long as you just stay nice and still and quiet, they're just not that bothered. They're like, oh, there's something there. Just sort of get around.
Well, threat to them, are they? And they're not aggressive, so.
No, they're not. I mean, there was one occasion where a guy got really freaked out, and his natural reaction was to, because sometimes you can't stop yourself from panicking because there's a huge shark and it's literally gone right in between your legs. And to try and stay still in that situation for some people is really hard. So he tried to sit up in the water, and his fins just came down. He didn't hit the shark, but his fins just came down in the water, and it just freaked out a little bit. But all it did was just whip its tail and just swim the other direction. Yeah, they're not aggressive. They're not out to get you. But obviously that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be respectful of it. So
No.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a really, really cool thing. And I mean, even if it wasn't the sharks we were seeing, even if it was just hanging out around the Sea of the Hebrides, it's just amazing. Like, the amount of life that's there is phenomenal, and it's so nice to be able to. I think you'll agree with me. One of the nicest things about science communication, about filmmaking, about any role like that, is that you're actually seeing people in real time see these things for the first time and be like really amazed by them.
Oh yeah,
so
definitely.
Yeah, you can even swim down to the kelp, pick up a starfish, and people are just minds blown by it. It's really cool.
It's great. It's another world, isn't it? And I'm quite glad that I've been able to showcase on my podcast. 1 minute we've got Gamekeepers, Conflict, and then Basking Sharks, and it's segued really nice. I didn't think you'd be able to link those two, so that was great.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I wear two different hats, really. So
yeah.
Like I said, where can I make the most difference? So conflict is one of the biggest problems. I mean, that's going to affect basking sharks as well. It affects every single species and habitat that we basically have. So trying to figure out how we can move past these better in a more efficient way, in a more effective way, is very important. But also at the same time, hanging out with cool animals and educating people about them is also really important. So I'm really, really, really lucky that I get to do both at the same time.
No, definitely. I certainly envy you with the baskers, for sure. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Isla.
No worries. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. And yeah, I'm definitely going to try and get up there and hop on a boat and see some basking sharks with you at some point.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Jack.
That was Isla Hodgson. I think it's fantastic to hear both sides. Often we tend to be so entrenched in one camp that you forget that these are people on the other sides and they've got their own experiences of these different things. Now this brings me to Nature Reserve of the Week, and I figured I'd go big this time. I'm going to go for Rutland Water. It covers 4,200 acres. That's not just the lake, but surrounding countryside also. But Rutland Water is the largest man-made lake in England by surface area and one of the largest in Europe. 971 acres is managed by Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust and is home to the British Birdwatching Fair every August, affectionately known as Bird Fair. Some people call it the Glastonbury of wildlife watching. I think that's a little bit misselling it. You're not going to see too many people out of their tits on acid at Bird Fair. Maybe the odd one, but it's a bit tamer than that. But it's well worth a visit if you've never been to Bird Fair. The reservoir is home to internationally important numbers of breeding birds, like 4% of Europe's gadwall. Great white egret are pretty common there now as well, so more and more birds are turning up. Ospreys are probably what Rutland is most known for, certainly within England, and some were taken in Scotland in 1996 and reintroduced there. So ospreys are now a very common sight on the lake. There's a nest cam on one of the pairs, so you can regularly see them, and obviously while we're all locked indoors at the minute, it's great to check in and see how those ospreys are doing. Not too far away, you've got Hornmill Trout Farm, and this is actually a photography setup where you can go in and photograph these ospreys. These ospreys have been visiting the trout farm for years, way before the photographers started taking the odd small trout. And rather than get mad, they set up a photography business. So it's a really, really successful hive. Ospreys coming in the morning. I think it's open March to September. Well worth a visit if you want to get diving osprey shots. I think it's the only place in England that you can do that. Now there are 8 nests of ospreys, but only one of them is actually on Rutland Water. The rest are all in the surrounding countryside. There are 2 visitor centres, the Angling Water Birdwatching Centre and the Linden Visitors Centre. And they've both got facilities, no calf, but refreshments available with toilets and all that kind of stuff. There are 31 hides there. That's bonkers. So plenty of places to watch the wildlife, including one that overlooks the osprey nest, and you can watch these ospreys coming in. There are 6 angling water centres, All of those have parking, they have toilets, and 4 of them have better food and drink facilities. So they're not the kind of specifically catered for wildlife, but you can go and have a meal and stuff if you really want to do that. It's £6 to enter the reserve, and obviously there are discounts for Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust members. So it's a huge place, well worth visiting if you're in the area. And if you are coming specifically for the bird fair, it's worth coming a day or two early, or maybe staying a day or two late, and exploring this incredible nature reserve. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. This has been the Bearded Tits podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks, and I will catch you in the next one. Cheers.